Hi there, welcome to Israel Explained. As you may have heard, a few things have happened regarding this conflict, so let's get to it. I'm your host, Ben-Ephraim, by the way. Okay, so Hamas has said yes to a ceasefire deal, but it's not a ceasefire deal that Israel has actually agreed to. Instead, it appears to be something that was offered to them by the mediators. According to reports in the Arab press, this is the deal that Hamas has said yes to. It will have three phases, like all of the deals that we've been discussing in the last few days. Phase one will be 42 days long, and it's the only one that is laid out in detail. The other two will be negotiated during the preceding phases. So in this phase, Israel will withdraw from most of Gaza to areas close to the security fence and will stop overflights for 10 days. Will let in 600 humanitarian aid trucks a day, 50 of which will be fuel. Hamas will release 33 humanitarian hostages that have often been discussed. However, they're not willing to guarantee that these hostages are alive. So some of these 33 humanitarian hostages may be dead bodies, something that Israel is very upset about and doesn't bode well for how many prisoners Hamas can return. Um, as compensation for that, Israel will release the heaviest prisoners that it has as selected by Hamas, reportedly including Marwan Barghouti, who will be brought to Gaza. Israel is also expected to release all the Shalit deal prisoners. So the 1,000 terrorists that Israel released to get back um, Shalit, Gilad Shalit, in a previous deal. Israel has since reapprehended many of them, and Hamas is demanding that those people be released. Then Hamas will release the female IDF soldiers in exchange for 50 Palestinian prisoners each. Israel will release all women and male prisoners taken since October 7th, including the worst offenders. On the 22nd day of the deal, the IDF will withdraw from the central Gaza zone, separating the north from the south. There will be no limitation on the return of evacuees from the south to their homes. Then the next two phases, there's not too many details because they haven't been negotiated yet. Phase two is 42 days long. In it, Hamas will receive a guarantee that the war will permanently end. That's been the main sticking point. This is something that Israel has not been willing to do. The United States has reportedly been giving guarantees behind the scenes that this will happen. All men left alive will be released during this phase. Phase three is 42 days long. In it, all dead bodies will be exchanged. Israel will give back the bodies that it has. Hamas will give back the bodies that it has. The sides, including the mediators, will come up with a plan to rebuild Gaza over 3 to 5 years. Compensation will be paid to the Palestinians harmed in the war. Egypt, the US, and Qatar will uphold these agreements and their fulfillment. Now, Hamas sources have been saying over the last 2 days that they've received firm guarantees for Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, who's been in Doha negotiating over the last few days, that this deal will stop the war. Um, Hamas said that it's sending a delegation to Cairo to finish up the details. Israel will also be sending a delegation to Cairo, even though they haven't accepted this deal. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, this maneuver, the whole idea behind it, was to place the ball firmly in Israel's court. So if they invade Rafah, it will look like they're rejecting a reasonable deal, and it's Israel's fault. That they hope will renew massive international pressure on Israel. Israel's response to this has been pretty good. The cabinet met and decided unanimously that Hamas' answer is a bad one, and that the deal that Israel agreed to and this have too many gaps for Israel to accept this. But a source in the government said to the press, quote, our arms are outstretched and we are sending a delegation to Cairo so that we can hammer out the details and overcome the gaps. Nonetheless, the operation in Rafah will continue. The thinking behind all this um, is that Israel does not trust at all what Hamas is doing here. One member of the cabinet told Channel 12, quote, this is a maneuver to make Israel look like the party that said no. But Israel is aware of that, and therefore is not giving an absolute no. It's saying we will send a delegation to Cairo, but it's also saying we will continue to use military pressure because I think there's no question that Israeli preparations for an invasion in Rafah are what led to this outcome. Israel has, for too long, given up the advantage that it has militarily and the way that it can use that to pressure Hamas into releasing hostages. Now it's rediscovered that power, better late than never, and is willing to use both tools at the same time military pressure and negotiation, something it should have been doing this whole time. Um, so, what Israeli pressure led to this maneuver? In the morning, the IDF gave out a message to the people of Rafah saying the following quote, the IDF has expanded the humanitarian area in Al Mawasi and is calling on the civilian population to move temporarily out of the eastern neighborhoods in Rafah to the expanded humanitarian zones. End quote. Now, those expanded humanitarian zones stretch from the outskirts of Rafah through the Al Mawasi into Khan Yunis. They include more than one field hospital and a lot of facilities that the people will need in order to survive in the area. It looks to me like Israel has learned a lot of lessons from previous refugee crises and will perform better this time. The IDF has also been scattering leaflets, especially to the neighborhoods that it wants evacuated, instructing them which routes are safe to travel. Civilians were told that the IDF will, quote, act robustly in your area. They also warned that anyone who helps or is part of terror organizations is endangering their lives and those of their families. For your safety, evacuate to the expanded Al Mawasi humanitarian zone. They also warned that Gaza City is still dangerous, to avoid going back north through the Gaza Wadi. They also warned not to approach the security fence to the east and south. So they didn't forbid the civilians there from going to Khan Yunis, but they encouraged them to go to the Al Mawasi humanitarian zone instead. It's believed that the area that Israel has evacuated contains 100,000 Palestinians in it. The reason this area was selected is not only because it has easy access for the IDF, because it's near to their staging points, but also it contains elements of three of the four Hamas brigades in Rafah, and most importantly, the Rafah crossing is in there. And we've just received reports that the IDF is moving towards the Rafah crossing. Um, it's moving up the Philadelphia corridor to there with the support of the Air Force and the artillery, and will probably take it within the next few hours. There's a good chance by the time you're hearing this, Israel will have taken Rafah or will be very close to it. So all this massive pressure that Israel has all of a sudden put on Hamas has borne fruit. But American actions also played a part in this. A few hours before the Hamas announcement, Biden and Netanyahu talked on the phone. The talk went much more cordially than the Israelis were expecting. Biden did not tell Israel not to go into Rafah. In fact, he gave them a yellow light, saying only evacuate the population. That was the stick that the Americans are using to frighten Hamas into accepting a deal, allowing Israel to go into Rafah. And that's one of the reasons Israel is doing what it's doing. But there's also a carrot. Bill Burns is in Doha, and he appears to have promised Hamas that if they accept this deal, the deal will end the war. He may have given some level of U.S. guarantees that this will happen. So between that carrot and that stick, he's made it much more likely for Hamas to agree to a ceasefire. Now, some people are saying that this offer is meaningless because Israel hasn't accepted it, but it isn't. This creates massive pressure domestically on both sides. Residents of Rafah were seen celebrating the end of the war. Now they're realizing that that didn't happen, and they'll be very upset at Israel, but also at Hamas, and they'll be putting pressure on Hamas to agree to this. Meanwhile, the families of the hostages will put a ton of pressure on the Israeli government to agree to this. Internationally, we know how much pressure is on put on everyone, and there's an increasing amount of pressure on Hamas. Talks about expelling them from Qatar and other measures. It's no coincidence that Hania, who is the Hamas leader in Qatar is the one who finally said yes to a ceasefire deal. So I think this makes a deal much more likely, although still it is not guaranteed. It's important to keep in mind two things. One, Israel is in a much better position now than it was a day ago. Its willingness to go into Rafah has put it back in the driver's seat. And a lot of warfare is about information. It's about knowing where your enemy's red lines are, knowing how strong their hand is. That's why you try to hide that from your enemy. Israel learned something very important about Hamas today. It learned that it wants a ceasefire far more than we thought it did. It learned that Hamas is far more scared of the IDF going back in than we thought it was. That is a sign of weakness and one that Israel should exploit, but not by overplaying its hand, by applying pressure and continuing to negotiate. Um, it's important to note that even though Israel's position right now is much stronger than it was, and Hamas has shown a good deal of weakness, this doesn't change the trajectory of the war, at least not yet. The only way Israel can win this war, as I've said several times, is if it takes over all of Gaza, replaces Hamas with another government. As of now, it doesn't look like there's much chance of that happening. Okay, so I have a lot of questions from you guys, and many of them are relevant, even though they're pretty old, from 5 days ago or however long it's been. So let me answer them. Vanna Loven says, post ceasefire, what will military operations against Hamas look like? Gaza, West Bank, and internationally. I find it hard to believe violence won't start again soon, even if subdued, especially in the context of Israeli Iran rivalries. So, unless Hamas is removed from the Gaza Strip, at least as the leadership, there will be a continuation of hostilities. But it is a question of when. After the war in Lebanon, which was also a disaster in many ways, Israel managed to deter Hezbollah from acting for a long time. And there's a good chance that this will happen again, and that there could be quiet for a few years. Possibly throughout the 5 years Hamas wants to rebuild the Gaza Strip. That could be what they're calculating. We need 5 years to recover, 5 years to rebuild the Gaza Strip. I could see that happening. Will Israeli military operations look like? That depends on the governing apparatus in in Gaza. If Hamas takes back control, then every operation could be a real problem. And Israel would only go in if there were serious issues. And that, like I said, could be a few years before that happens. If PA takes over with some kind of united government, which there are talks about right now, although I don't know how serious they are, then Israel could possibly cooperate with that government for security operations. Um, so we don't yet know what the mechanism in Gaza would look like after the war, and that's why it's hard to to answer it. But I think we'll definitely see a bit of quiet there after the war for a while, but only so that Hamas can rebuild and restart. This is by no way will this end the conflict. Sunny LaBouffe asks, let's assume the war is now for all intents and purposes lost. What's next? Obviously, the first priority is to remove the government and put us in this situation. But after then what? How does Israel recluse some of its strategic and international standing? And how does it hold to what increasingly seems like a terminal downward spiral? So, yeah, one of the most important things is to replace this government. But you're replacing the government in order to achieve certain things, not just in order to replace them. Israel would have to move towards a more pro-Western, less isolationist bent than it's heading towards now. If it could normalize with Saudi Arabia, move towards a Palestinian state, at least make noises that it's moving towards a Palestinian state, play the diplomatic game, it could recoup a lot of its international standing. A couple of people I've been talking to, and Nadav Eyal wrote an op-ed about this in Ynet, have said that Israel could actually use the ICC in order to regain its reputation. If Netanyahu was used as the fall guy for this military operation and for the harm that it's caused Israel's standing, he could serve as a sort of Israeli Milosevic, where afterwards Serbia rebuilt its reputation slowly. If Israel could, say, give over Netanyahu and others to the ICC, then maybe it could try to turn over a new leaf. These are various ideas. But that sounds far-fetched, and it's hard to believe that the right wing won't retain a lot of power in Israel. So my guess is we're probably going to see Israel continue to be in isolation, and that the hit that it gained to its standing will linger. Not that it will necessarily get worse or that Israel will become a pariah state. That could happen if Ben Gvir and Smotrich continue to guide policy. But even if they don't, I think the hit will linger and continue to hinder Israel for a long time. Fred Aaron asks something similar. What do you see as the post war future for Israel? It seems there are many scenarios, but none of them good. Clearly, Netanyahu saw himself as King David, but it turned out to be more like the infamous King Ahab. So, yeah, as long as Netanyahu is in charge, Israel's standing has very little um, good chances. Without him, it could go all sorts of ways. So I already illustrated what could be a good scenario for Israel. I could see that happening. Gantz, Eisenkot, even Gallant, someone like that, could lead Israel to a better place than it is right now. But a lot of Israel's problems are insoluble. But Israel's always existed with problems. I'm not completely and totally pessimistic. Grogov asks, what do you expect phase two negotiations to look like? Israel has a trump card agreeing to the reconstruction of the Strip. The Biden administration may not love Israel wielding this card, but it is also committed to Hamas no longer being in charge. What do you think Israel could achieve under a competent negotiating team in these alleged phase two negotiations? So, according to the deal that's being discussed right now, this would be phase three rather than phase two, the rebuilding of the Strip. Um, that is something that Israel can leverage because Hamas needs it, but maybe not as much as you think, because Israel needs it too. Israel's doctrine, which has been challenged for sure, has always been that if um, Hamas is a miserable, failed state, there's more likely to be violence, and if Hamas is a stable, rebuilt place, it's less likely to be violent. That remains true, of course, with Hamas in charge. There's never going to be a really peaceful regime in Gaza. But Israel and the rest of the partners in this negotiation also want Gaza to be rebuilt. There's no one that wants it to remain a failed state because that's bad for everyone's security. So I'm not sure that Israel has that much leverage on it. David Field says, I have a theory based on speculation that there is some link or secret agreement for Israel not launching a full Rafah invasion and the ICC not bringing charges. Do you think there's any truth to this theory? You know what exactly the decision-making process is for the ICC to bring charges. So regarding the first thing, there's no secret agreement, or maybe it's so secret I don't know about it, but no, I don't think there is one, but there is a link. If Israel stops the war now, it's less likely that the ICC proceed with warrants for anyone. It's also less likely that the ICJ find against Israel. If Israel continues, there'll be a feeling that the actions Israel is committing need to be stopped, that there needs to be deterrence against it, and that makes it more likely that the charges will be put forth. The decision-making mechanism there is based on the prosecutor. The prosecutor has a lot of autonomy, and Han, the prosecutor, has been pretty reluctant to bring charges against Israelis in the past because he thinks that it's too political. And right now, there's a ton of pressure on him to do so. So if you remove the war, if the war stops, there'll be less pressure on him, and he may actually give up the whole thing. Something that Netanyahu is very aware of. Heidi Hergert asks, do you think hostage family protests have hurt the prospect of securing any live hostages? So I think that it's more complicated than that. On the one hand, all these protests from the hostages have lowered Israel's bargaining position. They made Israel seem weak, and Hamas has ratcheted up their demands. On the other hand, Netanyahu hasn't shown that the hostages are really important to his decision making, and the families have needed to put pressure on him to force him to take that more into account and to force other members of his cabinet to force him to take that more into account. So it's hard for me to say conclusively that the efforts of the hostage families have either hurt or helped their cause in this regard. But of course, they don't want to feel powerless and do nothing, and they don't trust Netanyahu to do what needs to be done without their pressure, which is one of the main problems here. Pratchett Guyman says, there was an interview in the Times of Israel with a representative of the Hostages Forum saying he had heard there was an offer from Hamas on the table on October 9th or 10th to return all the hostages in exchange for not invading. Have you heard anything about this? Does this seem like something Hamas would actually offer in good faith? So, yeah, of course I've heard about this. I don't believe it. I don't think that Hamas would actually release all of their hostages so that there wouldn't be an invasion. But I wouldn't be surprised if they'd be willing to release some of them. It's too strategically important for them to keep hostages as leverage over Israel. And also, Sinwar and others didn't believe that the Israeli invasion would be as severe as it was ultimately. So I doubt they would have given that up. My guess is that people are screwing with the hostage families. By people, I mean Hamas, most likely, which would not be the first time they did something that cruel. FRDZ4KB asked the following question. If we're saying Hamas doesn't actually want a deal and is just LARPing over negotiations, but cleverly negates Israel's ability to act on Rafah or pretty much anywhere else in a decisive military manner, wouldn't the right play to be to accept the Hamas offer if it is anywhere near reasonable? Then either they're locked into a deal they didn't really want, or uh, because they probably rightly through their eyes think that they're winning the war and will get everything they want, or they have to walk back their own offer, and not even idiots can blame Israel when they act then. Okay, so there's been sort of a change in our thinking, probably yours too, how much Hamas wants a deal. I think the fact that Israel accepted this deal, Hamas accepted this deal, even though it's not a good one, and it's also a way of pressuring Israel, means that Hamas wants a deal more than we thought. Um, I think that Israel should probably consider accepting a deal if the terms change somewhat in Israel's benefit as a result of this Rafah operation. Israel only has two options. One is to try to actually win the war, which I'm not sure that Israel is actually willing to do, or to accept an offer after this military pressure is put. But yeah, the whole thing that you laid out here makes a lot of sense. But Hamas will agree if Israel agrees to something that ends the war. So I don't think that this logic necessarily works anymore. Hamas definitely wants a deal more than we thought that they did. Okay, so thank you so much for joining me. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon. I have a new episode out of my podcast talking about how Israel became a monarchy in biblical times. So check that out. And I will probably be back very soon, considering how developments are moving.